Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here with us. Today, we begin a series of reflections, conversations, forums on the Amazon, connectivity, indigenous territories, a challenge in the new global framework of biodiversity. These reflections and conversations are being promoted by the North Amazon Alliance with the support of Campaign for Nature. I would like to thank in a very special way the participants in this first panel, María Hernández, Helena Alves, Harvey Locke, Felipe, Serrano, and Ernesto Ráez. And I would like to thank especially Juan Bello, who will be moderating this meeting. Juan Bello is a biologist with over 20 years of experience in biodiversity. He is the head of the United Nations program here in Colombia, the Program for the Environment, and is a focal point for Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia on ecosystems. This is going to be a very special panel, I think. I am very interested in hearing what they have to say, and I am sure that I will learn and I will be inspired by the participation and the new ideas that will be presented. I thank you very much for being here, and I give the floor to Juan Bello. Thank you. Martin, it is a great pleasure being with you on this first session of the series of webinars. It is an honor to share this space with you, especially because of the topic that we are addressing today. And being able to talk about the Amazon in terms of indigenous territories connectivity is vital, not only for the region, but also for the whole planet. So that is why it is an honor for me being the moderator of this session. As you mentioned, today we have the honor to have an excellent group of 5 experts that are here today as panelists. I am going to introduce each one of them, and then we will begin with their interventions. So first of all, it is a great pleasure to present María Hernández, President of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. She has over 25 years of experience in international environmental law and international negotiation on biodiversity. We have been colleagues at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute in Colombia, where she was the director of International Affairs Office, and at that time as head of International Affairs of the Ministry of the Environment, Housing and Territorial Development of Colombia. Also, she was a professor at the University of Rosario and Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogotá. Welcome, María. We also are here with Harvey Locke, lawyer and environmentalist. And after many years of volunteering in conservation initiatives, Harvey became a full-time conservationist dedicated to national parks, wilderness, wildlife, and large landscape conservation and connectivity and climate change. He is currently chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas working group. The group is in charge of analyzing beyond the Aichi targets task force, and he is co-founder and senior advisor to the Yellowstone to Yukon and Nature Needs Have conservation initiatives. Welcome, Harvey. We are also here with Felipe Serrano, who is Executive Director of Nature and International Culture in Ecuador. Felipe is a biologist, mastering management of tropical biodiversity, University of São Paulo, Spain, and he was also a university professor for many years. It is a pleasure to have you here, Felipe. We are Also here with Helena Alves-Pinto, and a few minutes ago, I knew that she decided to work on the UN program for the environment for the regional office in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are colleagues now. Welcome, Helena. Helena is a biologist with a master's degree in applied ecology and conservation from the University of East Anglia and a doctorate in ecology and conservation from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She has more than 8 years of experience in topics related to biodiversity conservation, land use change, environmental economics, and political ecology. In her Ph.D., Helena evaluated the role of other effective area-based conservation measures established in Aichi Target 11 and the effectiveness of local communities in preventing deforestation in the Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon. It is a pleasure to have you here, Helena. And finally, it is a pleasure to have here with us Ernesto Ráez, who is an ecologist, researcher, educator in nature conservation, indigenous peoples, ecosystem approaches to health, and critical analysis of development with an emphasis on the Amazon. Ernesto graduated from the National Agrarian University, La Molina, Master in Latin American Studies, Tropical Conservation and Development from the University of Florida, and currently he is the Executive Director of the Institute of the Common Good. Welcome, Ernesto. So before we begin with the first presentation, I would like to highlight some aspects that we consider fundamental for this webinar. First, 10 years ago, actually 11, when the final negotiations were being made in the biodiversity strategy for 2010, which led to the Aichi targets, we made a call upon the urgency to have ambitious goals at that time. And a call was made based on the observations that had been documented in terms of loss of biodiversity, and they were critical at that point. And then when it reached 2010 in Japan, there was a very important message of the urgency of action. There was a need to something to be made in order to reverse that loss of diversity. Last year, we had the chance to see different reports of the states of biodiversity, starting with the 5th report in terms of global perspectives of biodiversity, the GBO5, where it was stated that in general, it was not possible to achieve the Aichi targets. Some improvements had been made in some specific points, but in general, the targets were not achieved. Additionally, we've had a series of other reports, of course, the IPBES reports, as well as other reports as the Worldwide Fund. Also this year, a report was issued on the leadership of Peru, which is called May Commence with Nature. And what we are seeing is that this situation is dramatic as ever, that the trends are alarming, and we are entering in a planetary crisis that is revealing a different horizon. It is, of course, there is a sense of urgency, because what we could have made 10 years ago, now we have to do it faster and in a more strengthened way. In that context, we are seeing this new framework of global diversity, which has a different view, 2030 and progressively until 2050. We have to take this into consideration because we are moving towards a vision of living in harmony with nature, but that vision is each and every time very little, because biodiversity degradation is cumulative. And for that reason, we have to think of what does ambition mean in terms of these new targets and goals? What does it mean thinking about those alternatives? Clearly, what we can say is that although protected areas have been part of the targets and they have been achieved in certain countries, they are still insufficient to face the loss of biodiversity. And there is where we have to have a broader view in terms of the Amazon. And that is a topic that we have today. We are here in the presence of many experts on this topic that will be giving their own perspectives. And having said that, we will make a general review on these topics, and then we will move forward on each of those topics in order to deepen on each presentation. After, we will have a Q&A session. And after this brief introduction, I would like to give the floor to my great friend, María Hernández, who will be talking about what represent these goals in ambitious areas for the Amazon. María, please, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Thank you very much, Gaia, the North Amazon Alliance, for the invitation and being here today. And this is a very interesting topic because we are betting on life. And we are not only doing that with words, but also with facts. As you said, the biodiversity goals between 2010 and 2011, the Aichi target established some targets that at the same time, they are science-based, but also they are negotiated on the basis of a political environment and have economic repercussions. And all of that had to be assessed in order to reverse that loss in biodiversity. 10 years have passed, and as Juan Carlos mentioned, the global evaluation of the IPBES in 2019 showed how, despite the huge efforts that have been made in the world, the H targets were not met in 2020. And that was assessed by the Global Group 5, and we worked with the biodiversity group of work where we created a report in terms of a multilateral work. As Juan Carlos said, we were working with the World Wide Fund, UICN, as well as the UN, and we created a synthesis report. And the different reports said that precisely what Juan Carlos said. The message is very clear. We are on the wrong path.
So it's a more accelerated like never before. So in terms of protected areas, is one of the 4 goals that we have been doing better, moderate advancement. Not great, but moderately. So it's very clear to preserve the biodiversity. It's a process that had many phases. It is complex in itself. It depends enormously from the dynamics that is lived in the territories. To conserve is not only to go there and to put a territory, to establish a territory, because you can't do that. You must establish an area where you make process that conservation, that it includes the taking care of and also the recovery and rehabilitation on the restoring of the composition, structure, and functionalities of the ecosystem. Depends also from each case, the dynamics of the territory of the populations that depends on the biodiversity. In general terms, expansion and administration of the protected areas, including terrestrial areas of freshwater and marines also. It is very important to protect the biodiversity and also to stop the process of loss, but it covers only a few sites. We still haven't had achieved totally of ecological representation. It's very complicated. And in the Colombian context and in the Amazon context, we have to talk about the management, equal management of the areas. I would like to, before talking about numbers, and Juan Carlos had this question, the goals, the framework of the multilateral conventions of the global agendas that we establish are the goals that we achieve on paper. How can we make that the goals that are established, we can really make them happen through actions? We can make compromise, ambitious compromise, not only on paper, not only on making larger areas, but making them more effective in the management of the capacity of controlling and the recovering capacity of the areas that were protected. Now, let's remember that the main driver of the loss of biodiversity is the change of the use of the soil and the sea. Right now, 75% of the soil is transformed, like the 66% of the oceans, and according to projections of our experts of IPBES for 2050, around 90% of the soil is going to be altered significantly. So more than that, of the loss drivers of the change of the soil, and there's also the overexploitation of species, the pollution, the climate change, the invasive species also. More than that, we have to know the different drivers of biodiversity loss. The ones that have to do with our behavior, has to do with our goals and the social values. We see reflected the difficult situation of the management of protected areas and also areas of conservation. We see why we have the deforestation, why we have the enlargement of the agriculture frontiers, and why we have the territorial conflicts for illegal issues, why we have the poverty, lack of health, between others. We also know that in countries like Colombia, the complexity in the management of the areas that must be protected independently from its legal character, it is way more deep. It's deeper than in other territories in the world. So that's why it is what it's talked to you. It's focused on the governance, because the governance that must be adaptive, it has the participation of society and the effective mechanisms and distribution of benefits and financing and applying the rules for everyone. So this governance is in different levels. If maybe we're talking about the Amazon, we have to think also that what's the role that the government, the national government has. The government has a very important role here in supporting the institutionality that allows to preserve the areas, but also it allows that there is a strong investigation and effective conservation. And this not only is from the national governments, but also in the local governments and the subnational governments. The sound of this internationality is a key element to be considered for the success of this conservation. But more than the institutionality, the governance, or the traditional speaking, the institutionality of the regimes of local governance are very effective, and that we can see in the Amazon. The people from the indigenous people and the local community, when they are really working for a goal, for a clear goal, that is the protection of their culture throughout the protection of the territory and the biodiversity. So it's clearly our means, a very effective means of protection, of conservation. So that leads us to that we're seeing the work of establishing of the areas, or the protection of areas. We uh, can't say that this is an issue only scientific and a legal issue, but it is also related with the social process. The creation of the capacity and cooperation is totally necessary to work with communities, authorities, and civil authorities, also with indigenous people, with organizations, big organizations that are in different territories. Another subject that is very important from the governance for these territories, so complex territories like the Amazon, is the traceability and the action of to solving illegal problems. And this not only is to be inside of the state, inside of the areas that are protected, but out of those areas also, there are some corridors, and the implementation more than protected areas also include to fight the illegal traffic of wildlife, of timbers, etc. So we have to know that we can't talk only about specific areas or territories, but the mosaics of conservation and all the connectivity that we need, not only on the scientific area, but also for the corridors of biodiversity, but also so that we can work together with the drivers of loss of biodiversity. So to conclude, because I think I already uh, exceeded the time, the conservation is based on areas. It's one of the most important mechanisms, effectively, to stop the loss of biodiversity. But to talk about the conservation based on areas, maybe it is important to say that more than the percentage of the territory that is covered, what is important, what is said at the beginning, is the effectivity in the management of the conservation that is resulting from that management. This must go more than the protected areas. It is very important that there is a link between the work that has been done in and out of the areas to establish the impact of the connectivity, coordinate the management, and establish mechanisms of restoration of biodiversity with a capacity to work territorially with the community and monitor permanently that effectiveness and the impact of the areas and other measures of conservation based on areas. So I hope that this is a message that maybe can tell us from the global how we're looking this, how to make it happen, but also related with goals related with areas, and to be ambitious goals. And the ambition also is related with our capacity of doing, of action. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. I think that has been great to see that different points that you say and the different perspectives were what's related with the work of all the community of IPBES related with these issues, with the subjects. How this, for example, issues like governance comes out, and it means also how to look these problems from different angles. Later, we'll have the opportunity to interchange some of the ideas and have some conversation related to this topic. I would like to give the word to following panelist Harvey Love. As I said, he is the president of such an important group inside of the protected areas. And Harvey will talk to us about what represents the challenges, the new challenges, the emerging challenges in the context of the global framework of biodiversity.
Harvey, please, the floor is yours.
Bueno, entonces,
Okay, so I will speak in English for the most part, and I have some slides in Spanish. It is a pleasure to be here with you from my home here in Canada, from the Panelists National Park. So let's begin with the
con la meta Aichi 11. The current global target for conserving areas is 17% land and fresh water and 10% of marine and coastal areas. I was appointed chair of a panel that was invited to ask the question, what's actually necessary to do? And it's called the Beyond Aichi Targets Task Force. This is a survey we did of scientists around the world, 363 country individuals in 81 countries, and we asked questions about. And an important question was, what do you think of Aichi Target 11? Is it enough? And the answer was, it is nowhere near sufficient. There's an enormous consensus that it's nowhere near ambitious enough. Then we asked the question, what do you think of the bigger targets? Like nature needs half, la mitad para la naturaleza, or half Earth, or 30%. Much stronger agreement that that's what we need, very large, ambitious targets. This is a published study, Woodley 2019. We also did a study of the scientific literature, all the literature published over many years. And we found that the call to protect about half the world was well supported in literature, which ranged from 30 to 70% or more. And it's important to know that those studies are mostly of studying scale 1 of biodiversity. And biodiversity occurs in 3 scales. Scale 1 is species, genes, and ecosystems. Many times people make that short to just species, but it's all 3. But then there's a second scale, which is the scale of the interaction between those things and abiotic processes like rivers flowing. And then there's a third scale, and that's the health of the whole world, the scale of the Earth ecosystem, which is reflected in Rio Principle 7 and in the Living in Harmony with Nature vision. And we must act across all 3 scales, not just scale 1. This is a kind of an Earth system approach. So you'll see in the vision of 2050, Living in Harmony with Nature, sustaining a healthy planet. And in Rio Principle 7, the health and integrity of the Earth ecosystem. That scale, as well as others, are what we need to focus on. And Rio Principle 7 applies to the SDGs also. This led a number of us to create this idea of a global goal for nature that's nature positive by 2030. Taking a whole Earth system approach, how do we turn the curve from a -1 that was described earlier to a +1 by 2030 and then get to full recovery? This is the idea of a nature positive world. The G7 leaders, which is countries like Canada, the United States, the UK, Germany, Japan, France, Italy, all came together, and their presidents and prime ministers, so President Biden, Prime Minister Trudeau, President Johnson, and said, well, the world must become not only net zero carbon, in other words, zero net emissions, but also nature positive in a compact this last month. It was just 2 weeks ago. And it says we will support and drive new global targets to protect at least 30% of global land and at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030 as a foundation for the effort required. This is important because this is actually the first global agreement we have among 7 leaders in this respect, and it just happened in the last 2 weeks. This is the current language of the zero draft of the Convention of Biodiversity, which is going to replace the Aichi targets. And our conversation has been framed in Target 2, by 2030, protect and conserve at least 30% of the planet. Also relevant, if you think of biodiversity at all 3 scales, is Target 1, about retaining most of the existing intact wilderness areas and connectivity among them. And also Target 7, increasing contributions to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So when we think of area-based conservation, we need to think about all 3 of these things together at scale. They are all required. And then here's the challenge. How do you have a target like 30% or 50% in a world that has very different conditions? It's not the same everywhere. This led us to create, my task force, to create this idea of the 3 global conditions for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. So this is about protecting and use, human use and nature's needs. But the world breaks down basically into 3 conditions or situations that we find ourselves in 2020. 18% of the world is heavily transformed in cities and farms. About 27% of the world is at the other end, very large wild areas. You see the Amazon here as a large wild area. You see the boreal forest of Canada, similarly a large wild area. And then the area in between 56% is in what we call shared lands, which is less than half modified and less than half, but more than half of 1% modified. So a lot of the world is in that middle condition. And we need strategies that work across all 3 simultaneously. No one is more important than the other. They all must happen to preserve biodiversity and achieve sustainable use and achieve equity and the sustainable development goals. I'm going to focus, however, on number 3, grandes áreas silvestres, because that's, of course, when we talk about Amazon, that's what we're talking about. This is from a recent report from Ana Maria's organization, Biodiversity and Climate Change, where this 3 conditions framework was embraced and adopted and called SCAPES. And then the language directly related to the Amazon is here. The multifunctional SCAPES approach can significantly contribute to minimizing, reversing climate and other impacts. Large intact wilderness and critical habitats, such as the Amazon rainforest and the open ocean, play an essential role for global biodiversity, climate, and other functions. That's those 3 scales of biodiversity I was talking about, not just the first scale. Yes, the Amazon is the most species-rich place on Earth. But that isn't all that it matters for. It matters as these other scales. So what does it mean? This is a map of the 3 conditions in Amazonian countries. You see one of the largest blocks of large wild areas still left on the planet. Large wild areas here. And why it's important, this is a photograph I took in the Blackwater Amazon north of Manaus. This is the forest generating the rain. This is not rain falling, this is rain coming from the forest, which actually is a function of the forest, not of just the species, not of representation of different ecoregions, but of the forest as a whole and its health, which creates the moisture, which continues to share moisture all the way across the Amazon in this sort of aerial river concept that sometimes our colleagues talk about. And in condition 3, this large wild areas condition, our goals for conservation need to be to retain or retener la integridad ecológica general y los procesos globales relacionados, como el almacenamiento de carbono y la regeneración de lluvias y los cursos fluviales.
As well as
Natural processes that drive the health and structure of the world. And in the Amazon, it looks like we need about 80% forest cover interconnected, especially in the northern Amazon, which is the topic of this conversation. Why? This is a map of carbon above ground in the trees in the Amazon. Dark blue is where it's most concentrated. You can see an enormous concentration, and the green is the next most concentrated. In the northern part of the Amazon, the whitewater Amazon in particular, or what Brazilians call the Solimões, the upwater part. This is a study of biodiversity and carbon at a global scale. And the carbon in this case is both in the soil and in the trees, so peatlands and in trees. And this shows that the upper Amazon is one of the most important places on Earth for combined values of carbon and biodiversity, just like you see northern Canada's boreal forest, the Congo Basin, Southeast Asia, the Yunnan area of China, Western Ghats of India. There's very important places for both biodiversity and carbon. So we need to be focusing on what these systems need at the Earth system level. If we look at the world's free-flowing rivers, which are essential hydrological process that animates the entire landscape, is essential to the maintenance of life on Earth. It's heavily compromised across basically three conditions also. And the Amazon, particularly the northern part of the Amazon, is one of the great concentrations of free-flowing rivers on Earth. This is very important to the structure and function of the world. However, this is a study of threats to rivers, and the upper Amazon is one of the most threatened areas in the world by hydroelectricity development. This is a very serious issue. Hydroelectricity is described as green energy, but it can actually be disastrous energy for biodiversity. And we have to be very alert to this, especially in places like the Amazon. This is the current and proposed dams in the upper Amazon. So why does this matter? It matters because these dams become sediment traps, barriers where the sediment is trapped, and then it does not release seasonally downstream in floods. And the lower part of the Solimões, or Amazon to Spanish speakers, before it reaches the Rio Negro, is an Igapó flood forest. It depends on sediment discharge. It depends on flooding to actually achieve the functioning of the whole landscape. And as my friend Avesita Chichon says, the Amazon is actually a river, not just a forest. It's this whole function at the Earth scale that drives it. 80% forest cover, wild rivers, that's the Amazon. And it's full of indigenous people and local communities who've been there a long time, who depend on all of that function too. We must maintain all of that. This is where Rio Principle 7 comes in, at the level of the global conventions. We have a shared responsibility, but it's differentiated by what we've done in the past and where we are in the present. But we all must come together. Canadians, Europeans, South Americans, everyone, Chinese, must come together to keep the Amazon intact. At the scale of 80%, at the scale of wild flowing rivers, if we want the health of our planet to continue. This is why a number of us advocate for a top-level goal to be in place across all the conventions at the Climate COP in Glasgow this year, at the Kunming Biodiversity COP, and at the Stockholm Conference next year that will mark the 50th anniversary of global agreements, that we need an integrated goal of an equitable, nature-positive, carbon-neutral world. We need to think about how all these things come together, and one of the most important things we all must care about is the health and well-being of the natural processes of the northern Amazon. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Harvey. Definitivamente tener una perspectiva
Thank you very
planetaria
much,
para
Harvey.
poder
Definitely
entender
have a
las opciones
planetary
que
perspective
tenemos es fundamental.
to have the different
Y lo que nos has
options,
compartido
and it's very
realmente
important.
nos,
So what I've
nos
shared with us
plantea un horizonte muy, muy
really
concreto sobre el nivel de acción
places
que
that
tenemos que
horizon, a very
tener
concrete horizon
para
about the
la
level
Amazonía.
actions that
Muchísimas
was
gracias
required
por tu
for the
presentación.
Amazon. Thank you
Y
very
bueno,
much
tengo ya
for
varias
your
preguntas
presentation,
anotadas que esperamos tener
and
tiempo
have
al
several
final para
questions here,
poderlas
and
resolver.
let's hope to have
Con
time
esto
so that we can answer that. So I would like to invite here Felipe Serrano, which I mentioned is Executive Director of Culture and International Nature for Ecuador, who will talk to us about what it means to guarantee the connectivity of the global agenda of biodiversity, and to talk about all the topics that the spatial goals for the ecosystem connectivity. So I would like to invite Felipe to share with us his vision about this topic.
Hola, buenos días. Un placer
Hi,
saludarte
good morning.
desde
It's a
Cuenca.
pleasure
Muchas gracias, Juan,
to be here from Cuenca,
invitación.
from Ecuador. Thank you very much, Juan, for the presentation. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel.
Un agradecimiento efusivo a la Alianza
And I
por crear
thank
este espacio
to
de
North
reflexión
Amazon,
sobre el nuevo marco
Amazon,
global de biodiversidad.
for creating this space of reflection for the new framework of biodiversity post-2020.
Felipe Serrano, yo trabajo para
My
la
name,
Harvey
as Juan said, is
Internacional,
Felipe
una
Serrano. I work for
organización que trabaja en varios países de
International
América
Culture, which is an
Latina
organization that works in
que ha
different
tenido
countries of Latin
algunas
America
experiencias relacionadas con
and has
áreas
had
protegidas
some experience related with protected areas
Es un honor
and
también para mí
connectivity.
compartir este panel con
It's an honor for
Ana
me to
María,
share
con
this
Harvey,
panel
con Helena y
with Ana Maria, with
quienes,
Harvey, with
saludo
Milena, and with
los
Ernesto.
felicito de antemano. Si me
And I
permiten, por favor,
congratulate you
compartir la pantalla.
all. If you allowed me to
Perfecto.
share this screen.
Perfecto, gracias.
Okay,
Bueno,
great.
creo que para
Thank
todos
you.
es conocido y que la
I
conectividad
think that for all of
ecológica
us know
tiene
that the
múltiples
connectivity,
definiciones.
the
Quizá la
ecological
más
connectivity has many
aceptada,
definitions, but maybe
esa
the most
definición, ese
accepted
concepto de que es el libre
the
movimiento
definition is the
de
concept
especies y el
as
flujo de
the
los
free
procesos
movement
naturales que
of
sostienen
species,
la
of
vida
flux
en la
of natural
Tierra.
processes
Este es
that
una
sustain the
fotografía de
life
los
on
bosques
Earth.
secos del sur de Ecuador y
So
del
this is a
norte de Perú,
photograph of the dry
integrados
forests
en
of
un
the
gran
South Ecuador
paisaje
and the north of Peru, integrated
dominado
in
por
a
árboles de
very large
Guayacán,
landscape
¿no? Y
dominated by
muestra
trees,
esa
Guayacan
dependencia
trees,
de la
and
conectividad de los
shows
ecosistemas
the
que no
dependence
se ve
of the,
limitada por las
connectivity of
fronteras.
the ecosystem, which is not
Sin
limited
embargo,
by
pues
the
todos
borders.
sabemos también que la fragmentación
But we all know that the
provocada principalmente por el
fragmentation
cambio de uso de suelo ha sido y
provoked
es el
by
principal
the
promotor de la
change of the use of the
pérdida
soil,
de
it's
biodiversidad.
the main driver
La
of the
fragmentación
loss of
fractura el libre
biodiversity.
movimiento de las especies,
Fragmentation
comprometiendo su
fractures
supervivencia y
the free movement of
deteriorando
the
incluso
species,
los servicios ecosistémicos.
deteriorating the
En América
services
Latina,
of the
los datos,
ecosystems.
como ya
In
comentaron
Latin
algunos de
America,
ustedes,
the data that you said
críticos,
before
¿no? Las cifras nos
are
ponen en alarma
critical.
entre
The
1970
numbers
y el
make us
2016. El
to be
último estudio
alerted
de la
in
vida vivo
1970 and
WWF
2016.
dice que
Between these
se redujeron entre el
years,
94% alrededor del
it was reduced between the
94% de las
94,
poblaciones
around
monitoreadas
94%
de vertebrados,
the
¿no? Esto es una
populations
cifra realmente
of the vertebrate
alarmante y
species.
grave.
This is
Y que nos
an
demuestra
alarming
que las áreas
number.
protegidas,
It
aisladas,
just
las
shows that the
zonas
protected areas
intactas
are
del
isolated
planeta
and
o de
the
otras
intact
escalas del
areas of the
territorio, como
planet
comentaba Harvey,
or of the other
aisladas
scales of the
no
territory, like
ofrecen
Harvey
garantías para
told us,
sostener
isolated do
la
not offer
biodiversidad y
warranty
tampoco los
to
procesos
sustain the biodiversity,
socioeconómicos locales.
and neither for the social, economical, social
En
processes.
función de este factor, ¿no? En función de
Regarding this
concepto de
factor
conectividad y todo lo que se ha desarrollado en el
of the
planeta en los
concept of
últimos
connectivity on what is
años,
developed
especialmente en la
in
última
the planet
década,
in the recent
la meta
years,
IPSI ya
and especially in the
contemplaba
last decade.
para este
The Aichi
2020
goal
que al menos
also
el
already
17% de las zonas
saw for
terrestres
2020 that at least the 70% of
de
the
aguas
terrestrial
continentales
areas
se conservarían a
of
través de
continental
sistemas
waters
de áreas protegidas
was
administrados
conserved
de forma
through
eficaz,
the
equitativa,
system of protected areas
ecológicamente
managed
representados
in a
y
efficient
bien
way,
conectados. El IPBES incorpora
ecologically represented and very well
esta
connected.
denominación a
And
la meta cuantitativa,
to
pues
have this nomination
ponía una
to
valla partes
the goal,
para demostrar que
there was a limit
no
for the
solamente
parts to
metas
show
de
that
extensión de áreas
not only the
protegidas
goals of the extension of the protected areas that could be quantified, but also the global connectivity cover also a quantity goal. So the reports are very clear. The Protected Plans Report of 2020 about the question of how well are we connected, how well connected are the protected areas of the countries. The number is determinant. Apparently, only 7% of the protected areas of the countries are protected and connected. So this is due because there's numerous factors, because this is the reality, or maybe there are defects on the reports, there are fails in the reports of the parts. So I think it has been very important for the development of the methodologies to evaluate the connectivity of the terrestrial areas. I understand that has been an important effort in methodology for the quantification of the marine areas. But in this scenario of the post-2020, we have methodologies, very interesting methodologies that are standardized to report the connectivity, also in a scale that not necessary that are the jurisdiction of the countries. I'm seeing for the countries that constitute the tropical Andean countries that constitute the most important part of the Amazon basins, we have seen that there has been a lack of acknowledgement, official acknowledgement of certain strategies of management that are not institutionalized in norms of the countries. And there has also been the lack of information for other effective measures for the conservation that has still not been integrated to the reports. This means that the results for the Andean tropical countries especially, and for the Amazon, can be seen from a subjective perspective. Last year, 2020, in an effort, we made with the Humboldt Institute of Colombia and the Andean University of Simón Bolívar, I'm sorry, from Simón Bolívar University from Venezuela, and the Natura Foundation in Bolivia. We made analysis of the covered protected areas in co-regional scale in the Indian countries that constitute the high Amazon basin. This effort, I think, that it establishes an important standard to standardize a methodology to quantification of the connectivity, also to share this methodology with all the countries, Andean countries, a methodology to incorporate the evaluation of the ecoregions of the countries that made that establishing the protected areas in the 5 Andean countries, around 1,600 protected areas in these 5 tropical Andean countries, and also it was incorporated an analysis of the special human fingerprint to identify some measure the limitations of connectivity that the protected areas have in these regions. The results shows us that 14% of the protected areas of these 5 countries be protected and connected in 2020. So we couldn't achieve the goal of the 17% that was previously established in Aichi. The areas, the extension of the areas, we achieved 21% of the protected areas, but and the areas has doubled from 2021, but only a fourth of the ecoregions of the Indian Andean country would surpass the 17% of their protected area and interconnected areas. Ana María already said it, and Harvey already said it. 2020, we couldn't achieve the connectivity goal and representative, and it gives us many questions in the new decade. How well are these goals established, or these connectivity goals, and what would represent for the Amazon? What would this mean to the planetary scale, as Harvey told us, or what would this mean for a local scale also? I wanted to share this experience for the case of Ecuador. It has been a great challenge to gather the information related to protected areas and other effective measures for the conservation in the country. For the study that just I mentioned, and what we realize here is that the national reports did not acknowledge, and in the country there was not officialized the strategies for the development of connectivity among the protected areas in the country. In spite of the country, it's showing interesting go to institutionalize strategies of connectivity. Ecuador for becomes the first country that established a technical norm for establishing the corridors of connectivity and established officially for the first time the connectivity corridor Shanghai Monocarpo, which becomes the first connectivity in the region officially established. All these kinds of strategies were not reported by the country, has been reported, not been reported by the country. In the map on the right that you can see the dark green. Those are the protected areas, and the light green are the conservation areas promoted by the local governments. There are more than 20 areas that has worked together the last 2 years, has had placed their own budget, they have their own structure of governance, and they have platforms, huge platforms, working platforms where they interchange the information permanently, and they connect permanently, not only on the ecological connectivity, and they have shaped the conservation corridor that would give other numbers to the report of connectivity of the country. So if you see the index of protectiveness and connectiveness for Ecuador, and only for the protected area, it's only for 8.4%. And if you mix all the strategies that are working in this territory that has decades of development, where there are in local investments, the index
that is, the country would be the only one in the Indian region. I am not sure about this number, but that would be the only country that will achieve the Aichi protected and connected targets. This will make us think about the capacity that the Indian and Amazon countries have, as well as the systematization capacity of these experiences of connectivity, ecosystem representation of the region at the north of the Amazon basin. There is a region, a connected region of more than 250 million acres, and certainly our colleagues will refer to later. And it needs to be evaluated and shown in the reports. This will put in evidence all these initiatives And this will help to create a commitment between the parts to give it more relevance on one side, but on the other, to take into consideration the targets that have been stated in the post-2020 document that are referred specifically in terms of connectivity to 50% of terrestrial coverage territories subject to spatial planning. That would imply an improvement in connectivity, and in the target 2, at least 30% that will be preserved through the protected areas, as well as efficient conservation measures, as well as well-connected areas that should be preserved until 2030. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Felipe. I think it was a relevant presentation in order to understand the inherent reasons to translate those goals in measurable targets and measurable actions in the territories and achieve other aspects that beyond the declaration has to do with, of course, the connectivity representation, as well as the usage of all those aspects. As you mentioned, there is a series of questions that are still unanswered and very complex to address. There is also the need to set alternatives in order to translate those ambition levels in other approaches that can be relevant for the states and the governments. And later we can deepen in this topic, because for the Amazon, there are many implications. So thank you very much, Felipe, for your presentation. And with this, I have the pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Helena Alves-Pinto, who will be talking about the UMEX as the complementary strategies, the other effective area-based conservation measures. So let's deepen on this topic about the OECMs and why they are important in order to achieve the spatial targets in terms of conservation, protection, and sustainability of biodiversity. Helena, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Juan. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure being here in this webinar with you. I will be sharing my screen perfectly. Thank you very much. So,
gracias. Entonces, and otherwise I'm going to speak a not very good Portuñol. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank all of you for your presence and for the invitation. So, as Juan already mentioned, I'm Helena Alves-Pinto. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and I've just recently joined the UNEP team. But the work that I'm presenting here is based on previous research and on my PhD that I've been developing, that I finished last year, and on research that I've developed in the past year. So the views are my own. So I'm going to talk about these other effective area-based conservation measures that we call OECMs, and present some of the perspectives for the complementary conservation and strategies regarding the Global Biodiversity Framework. I'm going to divide my presentation into two parts. So first of all, I'm going to start talking about the context. So what are OECMs, where they come from, and then I'm going to move to present some of the perspectives, getting in more detail about what are the opportunities and challenges of these areas. So starting with the context, first of all, and I'm going to present here something that most of you have already seen and are quite familiar with that. Harvey also presented in his screen, and I'm not going to go and read through that, but it's important that even though we are already moving to the next round of targets, it's important that we go back to 2010 and to Aichi Target 11, because this was the first time that this term appeared. So basically what it says is that by 2020, ecosystems and biodiversity should be conserved through a system of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. The problem is that once this was defined and the targets were approved, no one really knew exactly what this term means. So policymakers, national leads and practitioners, they didn't know how to proceed and how to identify these areas. That's why in 2015, the IUCN Specialist Group on OECMs was created. The group is led by Harry Jonas and Kathy McKinnon, and they've been working since then to try to figure out a definition for this term, for OECMs, and then create a guideline to help people recognize and report other effective area-based measures. So in 2018, the CBD adopted a definition proposed by the specialist group. And in 2019, the guidelines on recognizing and reporting OECMs was published. And this was very important because it was the first time policymakers and actually the entire society had the opportunity to understand what these areas are, understand what the criteria for identifying these areas are, and understanding the next steps, so the step-by-step that they had to go through to identify these areas and report these areas. So what are OECMs? And I include here some of the criteria that has been described in the document. First, they are geographically delimited area. So especially you have to have a limit for these areas. They can't be classified as a protected area. So if you have an area that is defined and recognized as a protected area, this area can't be an OECM unless you decide to restructure your protected area system in the country and decide that it's not a protected area anymore, and then it's going to become an OECM. It has to be governed and managed in ways that it achieves positive and sustained long-term outcomes. So in other words, it has to be effective for biodiversity conservation. But it doesn't need to have the aim of conserving, so the primary aim of conserving. For example, here in Brazil, there are some local communities that their first aim is to, for example, conserve cultural diversity. And as a second aim, they aim to conserve biodiversity. Another example is the military areas. The military areas here in Brazil, they don't have the aim at conserving biodiversity at all, but it's expected they're going to be quite effective for conservation. So where are we right now? Currently, as I showed you, we have the guidelines for recognizing and identifying and reporting OECMs that has been published in 2019. And the specialist group is already producing a document which presents the step-by-step method for identifying. So it's a very detailed, including the variables that have to be assessed, and it should be released quite soon. Because the definition has only been made or defined in 2018, so it was very recent, there aren't many areas that have been reported already. So if you check in the WDOECM, which is it's in the Protected Planet website from the WCMC, you can see that by 2021 in June, there were only 506 areas reported. So it's expected that this number is going to start increasing, and there are some countries that are already working a lot to recognize their areas. So for example, Canada is very advanced on that, Colombia, Mexico, they are working on that, and some other countries haven't really started discussing what they're going to report. So Brazil right now is in this position. We haven't been discussing what are going to be the next steps for that. And of course, we have to wait for the next COP, which is going to be at the end of this year, to understand whether the OECMs are going to continue in the proposed targets, and if so, what are the next steps from next year on and for the decade. Right, so I'm moving now to the second part, and I'm going to present some of the opportunities and some of the challenges of OECMs for biodiversity conservation. The information that I'm presenting here in this section is a result of my research in which I interviewed several experts on the topic, and I analyzed their answers, so you're going to see some of the responses that they gave. So the first opportunity, and this is actually one of the main responses from the interviews that I got, is that the main opportunities for OECMs is that they can contribute for the recognition of these areas. So once these areas are recognized as an OECM, it's likely that they're going to be incorporated into the conservation agenda. And from there on, there are lots of consequences from this. So to give you an example, they increase their chances of being funded. If you're talking about a local community, for example, you can increase the pride and empowerment of these communities. Because of that, you can have a maintained management, sustainable management, if it's the case, resulting in long-term conservation and maybe, why not, recoupling nature and social systems. So there are several consequences of recognizing an area as an OECM. The second one is that many interviewers believe that these areas are going to actually be very effective for biocultural conservation. The first reason is that some of them mentioned that the guidelines published are quite strict. So very few areas are going to be able to be recognized as OECMs. And in my PhD study, I actually saw that some of the candidate OECMs in Brazil, which includes indigenous lands, it's open to debate if indigenous lands are going to be OECMs or not. Quilombola territories that are areas that are inhabited by former descendants from slaves in Brazil. And both of them are very effective for curbing deforestation when compared to their control areas. And finally, another opportunity is that these areas can complement protected areas. So some of you have already mentioned they can complement in terms of representativeness. All of you know, and some studies show that some of the protected areas can be placed in places that are far away from threats or in low opportunity cost area. And the OECMs can come and integrate and promote a more integrated landscape, creating connectivity and contributing for this integration. And of course, there are challenges. So the first one is related to the identification of these areas itself. So it's expected that OECMs are going to be very heterogeneous. They're going to be small and very numerous. They're going to have different governances. So it's going to be quite hard to identify them. And also some interviews mentioned that because the guidelines are very strict, it's also going to be very hard to identify these areas as well. Monitoring is another challenge. So even though today we have very different types of monitoring systems, satellites, on-the-ground monitoring, it is still a challenge to achieve the scale that we want to achieve and still get the detailed information that we need to obtain to understand if these areas are effective or not. And finally, we have to consider that we can have the Goddard's law, which means when an indicator becomes our final target. So some specialists say that this is more or less what happened in the Aichi targets, especially considering the 17% or the 10% area, because it became our main target and sometimes we forgot about measuring the quality of this area. So this is a challenge that we have to deal with. And what are the next steps then? So we have to wait for the next COP. And if the OECMs are actually going to be included in the next targets, we have to take action. So what are some of the steps that we have to think of to start implementing and reporting OECMs globally and nationally? So the first thing is to disseminate the criteria established in the guidelines. So people have to know what OECMs are. They have to know what are the criteria for identifying these OECMs. Second, countries have to assess which areas should be candidate OECMs. So which areas in their territories are going to be evaluated against the criteria mentioned in the guidelines. And also it's important that countries create a national framework to elaborate databases, of OECMs that can communicate with the WG OECM from WCMC. And I'd like to close here saying that it's very important that we remember that OECMs are not here to compete with protected areas, but they are here to complement protected areas. And more than reaching a target, they are essential for stimulating actors that are already working for conservation, but they're not being recognized for doing so. And there are many positive consequences from recognizing and bringing these people to the conservation agenda. So I guess that's it. Thank you very much. And over to you, Juan, again.
Muchísimas gracias, Helena.
Thank you very much, Helena. I think that have the possibility to understand what is the discussion, to recheck what it means in talking about the goals that we have, and it's very important, and also in front of how to guarantee, how to influence politically from now to the next meeting conference of the parts of the Biological Diversity Convention. Thank you very much, Helena, for this presentation. With this, I would like to invite our last panelist of today, Ernesto Ráez. As I mentioned, is the director of the Institution of the Common Good. And I would like for him to talk about what means the Amazon for this biodiversity agenda, what means the goals for the Amazon, and also for the role of the indigenous territories would be a special goal, a very ambitious goal. Ernesto, welcome. Thank you, dear friend. Thank you for this invitation. And I'm very happy listening to you. I need to share screen. I'm Ernesto Ráez. Luna, I work in the Institution of the Common Good that is member of the North Amazon Alliance, as well as the Amazon Network of Social Environment Network, the Ráez. And as Juan said, these are the questions that we have. And I think that will allow us to unite all what all the other panelists said also. What does Action Target 2 means for the Amazon? In the framework for the actions of biodiversity post-2020, and what's the role of the indigenous territories regarding this target? And I wanted to remember us in its original version that for 2030 to protect and conserve throughout a system of protected areas and other measures based on areas that are effective for conservation and that are connected, at least 30% of the plan, with a focus on particular areas that are important for biodiversity. This goal, 30-30 goal, has some conditions that are very significant for analysis. Important areas, connected areas, and affected areas. Like before said, the Amazon is naturally important in terms of biological diversity, is the least fragmented area on the planet, is the most diverse biodiverse place in the world, and richness of species, and as Harvey said, a dynamic position of wetlands and aquatic ecosystems of forests, and the forest is not the Amazon is not an homogeneous place, area of trees in the country. It's a big lab, a biological lab, The Andean Amazon, particularly,
mencionó Harvey, contienen altas concentraciones de
as
carbono
Harvey mentioned,
debido a
has
largo plazo
high
en
concentrations of
esos
carbon,
suelos inundados de los
and
humedales
that
asociados
those
a
soils that are flooded with
amazónicas
wetlands
empiezan mucho antes
associated with the
empieza
Amazon
el
basin.
bosque
They come a
de
lot before
turberas o bofedales
than
altoandinos
from the woods,
y que se vuelven a encontrar estos bolsones de alta concentración
and
de
it
carbono retenido
comes
a
all
largo
together.
plazo
And the
en los propios
Amazon
pantanos de las
is
tierras
the representation of the carbon of all
la
these
biodiversidad
lowlands.
amazónica, entonces, no simplemente los
The
árboles,
biodiversity
conjunto
of
de
the Amazon,
interacciones
not
que
only the
forman
trees,
el bosque y
but
lo reproducen,
the all
regulan el clima
together
regional
interactions
y
that
regulan el clima
of
global
the
porque
forest
son
regulate the
participantes
weather
importantes
and
tanto
regulate the global
del
weather.
ciclo
They are
del
very
carbono
important participants
como en el
of the
régimen
carbon cycle as well as
y
an
esto
hydrological
vale para la
regime.
Amazonía como vale para cualquier otro ecosistema
And this
silvestre.
is
Y esto es muy
important for the
importante
Amazon as well as for
recordarlo.
other
Estamos tratando de
wild
salvar el
ecosystem.
mundo,
This is
no
very important to
solamente la
remember. We're trying
Amazonía.
to save the world, not
Todo
only
ecosistema silvestre,
for
saludable,
the
fósil,
not only the Amazon,
duradero
but all
y
the wild
reemplazable,
ecosystems.
de gases de efecto
And they're
invernadero.
not
Ninguna
replaceable,
máquina humana, ninguna
and
medida de la
none,
sociedad
not human
día de sí
machine,
misma
not
puede reemplazar
society
estas
measure
funciones
itself
de los
can
ecosistemas
replace these
silvestres.
functions of
Pensemos en uno de
this
los,
wild
una de las
ecosystem
condiciones que
functions.
plantea el Action
Let's
Target
think in one of the
es
conditions
conectividad.
that our
Y
action
como
target to
hace un momento
have the
veíamos,
connectivity.
este es un concepto
And
complejo, es un concepto
as we saw before,
transescalar.
this is a
No es lo
complex
mismo,
concept. This
la
is
conectividad
a scalable,
requiere
transcalable
una
concept.
mariposa,
It is not the same
es
connectivity that
una mariposa
requires
que requiere
a butterfly, that the
o la
connectivity that
conectividad
requires
un árbol de tierra
a snake,
firme,
or a
nosotros
connectivity that
encontramos, por
requires
ejemplo, en la historia
a
natural
tree.
de muchos insectos
For example, when we
donde
found in a
crece
natural history many
animal inmaduro,
insects where
una oruguita, por ejemplo,
the immature
es
animal
un hábitat
grows
de un
like a
ecosistema
small bug.
diferente que
It's
donde,
inhabited, and it's an different ecosystems
el adulto.
where
Entonces,
he spends his life as an adult.
una sola especie pueda mantenerse.
So for only
requiere
one
mosaico
species can
de
keep and
ecosistemas.
maintain
Y de
himself,
una
you need
especie a
a
otra,
whole
ese mosaico de
different kinds of
ecosistemas va a ser
ecosystems. And from one species to
diferente,
another,
¿no?
all these
Y la
ecosystems will
escala
be
en
different.
la que tiene que ocurrir
So
también va a
scale
ser diferente.
in which
Por ejemplo,
it must happen,
con
it will
las nutrias
also be
gigantes
different.
amazónicas,
For example,
estas son especies que
for
viven en
the
pequeños
giant
grupos familiares en las lagunas
animals
de
that live in
inundación,
small
lagunas meándricas
animal
de
groups
la
in
Amazonía.
this
Y
lake
por supuesto, estas están separadas
of the
muy
Amazon.
lejos unas
And
de
those four,
otras,
these are
entonces necesitan enormes
separated
extensiones de territorio
from each
para
other.
poder sostener
So
poblaciones
they
viables.
need
Pero
enormous
además,
territories
la
to have
conectividad de los
viable
organismos asociados
populations,
a los
and also the
ecosistemas
connectivity
acuáticos
of the
es muy
associated
diferente en sus
organisms
requerimientos
to
a la
the aquatic
conectividad
ecosystem. It is
requerida
very
a
different.
los organismos
It
de
is very
tierra
different from
firme.
the
Y recordemos
connectivity that
tiene aquel
required
mosaico
for the
de
organisms of
ecosistemas
that
acuáticos
live in the
y
soil. So this
ecosistemas
is
yuxtapuestos uno encima del otro,
our
interactuando
both
permanentemente
aquatic and
con el
soil
otro. Pero hay
ecosystems,
otra forma
both
de
interacting
interpretar también
permanently
la
with the other
conectividad,
one.
es en
So
términos de
there are
nuestra
other way
conectividad,
of
la de la
interpreting the
especie
connectivity
humana,
is in
nuestra
terms
historia
of our
natural
connection
con
of the
el
human
bosque
species, our
amazónico
natural
conocido como el
history
bioma
with
amazónico. Y allí es donde
the
caben
forest of the
los
Amazon,
territorios
of the
originales
bioma of the
de los
Amazon.
pueblos
And here
indígenas.
is where
Eh,
are the original
y es
territories of the
donde es
indigenous people.
importante que nos preguntemos cuál es la
And it
viabilidad
is
actual,
where it is important
ecológica y
to
económica
ask ourselves
de
what
esos
is the
territorios
viability,
para sostener a
ecologically,
estas gentes que
economic viability
son
to
los
support these
humanos
people
originales de ese bioma,
that are
que
the
por supuesto
original
han
humans
participado en
of
una
that
huella ecológica
bioma. And of course, they have participated
fundamentalmente positiva
mainly
de
constructively,
los ires y
mainly
venires
positively
del bioma que hoy en día todos
from the
queremos
different
conservar.
times
Y
the
esas
bioma that we will
adaptaciones
all preserve,
al bioma amazónico
and
se
those
expresan en las
adaptations
culturas, en las
of
culturas
to the
indígenas,
Amazon bioma,
en
it
los
is expressed in the
mitos, en las
cultures
narrativas,
and the
en las
indigenous
formas
cultures,
de
in the myths,
entender la
in the
relación
stories,
entre
in
seres
the
humanos
ways to
y
understand the
la
relationship between
naturaleza,
humans
lo que llamamos los valores
and
relacionales de
nature,
la
what we call the relations values of biodiversity. As you can say, the IPBES is preparing a report really how to value this diversity and how can we incorporate the different systems of value to our actions so that the biosphere collapses and falls all over us. So I have the honor to have I can verify this effort. And one of the most important concepts that we're working on are the values, the relation, the value that has the nature that are not, that makes us human, that makes it more humans through the relations with the nature. And of course, different cultures and different populations and different times of human history has different ecological fingerprints, and there's no doubt that this civilization, the current civilization, has one of the worst relations imaginable with the nature. As the General Secretary of the United Nations said, we are at war with nature. This is suicidal. And also, we can also talk with other kinds of connectivity. We can have the perverse connectivity that are in the Amazon in comparison with the demand of fuel and the materials that are required to sustain the international commerce, agricultural products, illegal products, traffic of wildlife that are mostly go to China, and this create a map of the rice where the blue part indicates the most part of threats of pressures of nowadays activities. Threats are the activities that would damage the Amazon. So you can see there is like a fence around the Amazon, around the tropical forest, the largest tropical forest in the world. And during the pandemic, this has worsened. Today, mostly and urban areas and export areas has allowed the progress of the destructive activities. And the fence is right now fence of fire around the Amazon. In Peru, my country, we have deforested more than 190,000 acres of land, and this is the record of the century. So it also represents a consolidation of the tendency where we are having in this century in the destruction of one of the largest biomes of mankind. So, how is this criteria of effectivity criteria? If we got ourselves through the remote sensors and the numbers, on paper, we already exceeded the action target 2. We're already on the 47.2% of the protected areas and indigenous territories that generally they keep the forest in all the Amazon, and so that we could feel happy that we could achieve the target, but we see really that the effectivity is very low. The Amazon states are actively supporting the worsening of the degradation of the forests of the Amazon basin, the deforestation, as I said, or the menace on the natural areas, protected areas, and the indigenous people that can no longer live there through the different politics and the lack of knowledge also that affect the indigenous people. And of course, from Peru, we can see that these territories are very fragmented. Small territories here and there that many times they are surrounded by destruction and, of course, cultural aggressions that are eroding the philosophy, the sustain this forest, the philosophy of the original forest that support them throughout education, for open education, openly racist.
And finally, when crimes are committed against indigenous people, go without judgment. I still ask myself, is there anything left to preserve without the peoples of the Amazon that will be the biggest biome of tropical forest in the planet without the resistance of indigenous people? My conclusion is that without them, there wouldn't be a lot left in the Amazon. Conservationists would have nothing to do in the Amazon. And let's remember that that protected areas are also indigenous territory, not because they are protected areas are not indigenous peoples' territories. And let's remember that indigenous peoples are the main defenders of the Amazon. No of the people present here today or I run risk for defending the Amazon. I don't run the risk of death for defending the Amazon, but all my friends here in this picture who have been winners of the Goldman Award, and they are very close friends, they are risking their own lives each and every minute when they defend the Amazon. And we currently know that the areas governed by the indigenous peoples are better preserved than the areas owned by the states and the governments. But all these areas and homicidal violence that these peoples are exposed to are generating great ecological, economic, and cultural instability. So what is the role of indigenous territories, or should we ask, what is our debt with the indigenous territories and their people? So what can we improve in the action target 2? At a global scale, I think it is very important to incorporate regional targets, especially explicit targets. 30 by 30 is a lot, it's too broad, and it would allow us to accept that our job is done with the Amazon and there's nothing left to do. But it is very important to differentiate the differences, and effectiveness in conservation is real in every biome. And the type of pressures and specific vulnerabilities that the indigenous people face and the guardians of nature in each biome. Another central element that Harvey mentioned, and see that here we have the same IPBES report, is that we have to integrate the climate goals and biodiversity goal in order to create possible synergies that are very important, but also to avoid greenwashing and dangerous investments. Friends of the Earth, as a coalition, as you can see from other organizations, just published a report called The Great Scam that shows how behind the net zero goal, many times it is a hidden agenda of not doing many efforts or not actually reducing the emissions in the global north, where it is pertinent, where it's needed to reduce the emissions. And moreover, other actions, and this is in the IPBES, other actions that can be good for the climate and end up being damaging for biodiversity, and consequently they can be negative for the climate. For example, if we replace, without reducing demand, if we replace eolic energy, the fossil fuel energy, today it is boosting demand on timber. And where do you think that timber comes from? It comes from the Amazon forest. Lastly, what should we do about the action target 2 and specifically the Amazon? On one side, I would like to challenge any of you to explain where or which part of the Amazon is not important to preserve, where we can still destroy, and why, as all scientists and experts of the world, what we have lost in the Amazon forest, we are at an inflection point, and we are at the risk of losing carbon very quickly. Also, we know that the Amazon under stress functions as a source of CO2 gases, and we need to incorporate those connectivity goals that not only refer to the forest, but also to all that complex interaction of water and terrestrial ecosystem that begin where the Amazon begin, in the Andes. Regarding the indigenous people, I believe that we have the duty to recognize their collective rights and to reject the utilitarian perspective according to which there is a need to recognize the territories in order to be taken care of, or since they need to be taken care of because they come from there and they are the ones who know how to adapt to a rainforest without destroying it. I think we need to promote the policy-making process, and their voice is very absent. Let's realize we are talking about the Amazon in this meeting, and we do not have even any indigenous voice. And of course, I cannot substitute it or represent it. Of course, we should protect their economies, their cultures, because we should not expect them to protect their forest and keep being a marginalized community as they are, at the same time protecting their lives against organized crime and homicidal violence that many times come from the government. And lastly, we need to reject private and public initiatives that insist on the exploitation of the Amazon under the old story of development. If we are able to incorporate a political vision to the action target 2, we can still be hopeful. Otherwise, we would have wasted our time with the Aichi targets. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ernesto. It has been wonderful to finish this journey with your talk. All presentations have been interesting, important in so many different aspects, and we still have around 20 minutes just to promote dialogue among ourselves. And I will ask you very short interventions in terms of questions. So it is very difficult for me gather the questions because they are so many and so complex. But the first one comes from what you, Ernesto, just mentioned. And for the Amazon, when we talk about connectivity, and that applies for other regions as well, but we are talking not only about an ecological connectivity or ecosystem connectivity, but also a cultural connectivity, but also about an intergenerational connectivity. These aspects are not considered when we talk about connectivity. So here we are referring to something that is explicit. So I would like to begin considering among the state members at an international level in the context of biodiversity convention, but as other aspects go beyond. When we consider this connectivity perspective, of course, cultural and intergenerational connectivity, are we entering into the human rights field as well? And here necessarily we would have to talk about access rights as well, that there are three: information, justice, and participation rights. So on those issues, we can develop on what you mentioned, how indigenous people can participate on these decisions that ultimately are about their territories, that the state are taking. It's easy to talk about each and every country as a delegation, and everything ends up in an agreement, for example, about a number, a figure, a percentage. But some countries are asking or demanding more ambitious goals, but others are so small that 30% is a lot, and so on and so forth. And among that, the reality of the territories, and even more of such strategic regions for the planet as the Amazon region, begin to dilute. So my question, and again, Ernesto, how can we ensure that the discussion of a new biodiversity global framework is between state members, including the voices of indigenous people clearly and having them clearly represented? So please, if anyone would like to comment about this. Well, since I am here, I think I can say a few words. I believe that we always run the risk in our international agreements to forget how politically deep and economic relevant that they are. In the UN Convention about Climate Change, and we know this very well because I was representing the Peruvian government there, it is the same, the indigenous people representation as a constituency than the oil companies' representation. And of course, that is not possible. Someone who comes in defending their own territory and their cultural heritage cannot be treated as the same who is there just defending revenue. That doesn't mean that the revenue and companies and corporations are not part of the negotiation. The important thing is that they are not represented as NGO, as they are there, because that changes the whole negotiation. The other idea, and this is a statement if you want to, is that the vision of those who call them Martin von Hinderman expressed as a conference in the current Colombia's constitution that give away great territories of the Amazon to indigenous people, and on the other hand guarantees the representation of the government of Afro-descendant peoples of Colombia and indigenous people. That guarantees, at least at a national level, that the indigenous voices and the natives peoples are being heard through these multilateral conventions where the states are represented. So, for example, at this moment in Peru, we have a debate regarding the need of a new constitution, and according to that, we are stating very clearly the need to incorporate representation of indigenous people as mandatory, at least in the decision-making levels at the government. And another obvious element is that we have to take concrete and different measures in each country in order to make sure to have a consolidation of the indigenous territories, the enhancement of those territories that needed to be enhanced, and the presentation of communities as well as autonomous conditions of governments. And here we will have to be very creative because there is a need to actually prosper as people and guarantee the existence of the biome. Thank you very much, Ernesto. Anyone would like to add anything on this regard or on this statement that Ernesto just gave us?
Offer a comment if I can.
Please, Harvey.
Indigenous people exist across all three of the conditions I mentioned. So, for example, in Peru, in the Altiplano area there, you have lots of indigenous Quechua-speaking peoples who are very different from the people who are on the other side of the Andes. They practice cultivation. People in the Amazon are more hunter-gatherers, typically, some cultivation. So we need to be careful that when we empower indigenous people, we're also recognizing who they are and what they do. And ideally, to me, we would have the indigenous representation across all three conditions, recognizing that the traditional indigenous ways are actually beneficial, even if you get the levels of potato diversity, for example, in the Altiplano, not just protecting wild territories in the Amazon. I've been to Manu National Park in the Amazon, where there's actually uncontacted people still, which is, I think, fantastic. And the second thing I would offer is Western science is telling us that humans are one species among many that shares the world with the rest of life, and that the whole world is actually moving. Continental plates are moving, rivers are moving, mountains move. That's a perception indigenous people have never lost. They have always understood that. And if we don't get that holistic view of the whole dynamic nature of the world, that everything is alive and working together to create the conditions we live in, we will actually have a very ugly 21st century for the rest of humanity. Whereas indigenous people have this inherently holistic view. So my view is that we should learn and embrace and engage that thought process in parallel with the Western scientific worldview. And of course, that means doing things like stopping saying there's a frontier where we can cut down all the forest and create progress. That is no longer progress in the 21st century. Cutting down a forest in a primeval condition is a disaster in the 21st century. It's never progress. It's always a bad thing. So let's recognize that, and then recognizing indigenous people who are present and empowering them to be part of it. And I believe also national governments have to play a role to protect and also to engage the Western scientific piece. Let's bring this all together and create the world that lives in harmony with nature, which right now we have not created. And so we need some humility also on the Western side, the Western science side as well.
Muchísimas gracias, Harvey. Y si me permiten,
Thank you very much, Harvey. And if you allow me, Helena, please, a reflection that starts from what Ernesto and Harvey said, is more from the philosophy on how to make it, and it's related with the fact that why is this so difficult? Because maybe I wouldn't like to be pessimist about this, but in the measure that we have been negotiator of the Convention of Biodiversity, but I'm also part of the world, the systems of knowledge of that involves the IPBES. The participation of the indigenous communities from a perspective, a political perspective, is very complex. But we have achieved to do it very well through United Nations Forum of Biodiversity and the indigenous regions, the 7 indigenous regions that United Nations recognize have some indigenous knowledge between them that are very active, that we can give them as a whole an aggregate value, a special values, and the work that they're and this network of indigenous knowledge do together with the Secretary of Convention of Diversity and to participate. And also the countries, if I'm not wrong, have it in the indigenous group of work that invited the countries to get involved, and they negotiated also, and the representative of communities, of indigenous communities. So there was this group also. But the question is, how can we include this worries, this need, this dimension of indigenous communities, local indigenous communities, and the peoples of this indigenous. We entitled the framework, Global Framework post-2020, that it's important right now. Of course, I cannot say this, but it does not correspond to me, but as IPBES, I said we can participate also in our knowledge that are scientific products. We can say the West science, but also the work and the result of our work with indigenous communities that are part of our knowledge, of the knowledge network, and we hope that they are based for the discussions. What is important is that the decision maker not only have conscience, but also use the knowledge, but from the science, from the traditional knowledge, and from different sources we give them, so they take the decisions that are correct. We can say, okay, the Amazon is ending the Amazon. Maybe the indigenous can say that, the biologists say this, and they can see and they can and they feel that they're impacted in their life. But if the decision maker does not take the decision, it is very complicated. So we have to do is a change, a real change that can transform in the way of international decisions taken to congregate all the different systems of knowledge.
Gracias, Ana. Y
Thank you
bueno,
very
nos
much,
quedan
Anna.
solamente unos pocos
We
minutos
have
antes de cerrar
just
esta
a few minutes
sesión.
before
Con muchos los
concluding the
elementos que
session with many
han
of
ido
the
en cada una
elements
de las intervenciones.
that we have had in many of the
Definitivamente,
interventions.
lo que
Definitely,
quisiera señalar en este
what I
momento,
would like to
antes
say
de
right
dar
now,
una pequeña ronda final,
before
es que al hablar de
ending, is
otras
to
medidas
talk
efectivas de
about other effective
conservación,
measures of
en
conservation
el contexto del
in the
marco global de
context of the global
biodiversidad,
framework of biodiversity,
de la Amazonía
of
en
the Amazon
particular,
in particular.
tenemos que
We
definitivamente
have
abordar
definitely
temas muy de fondo. Uno
talk
de ellos,
about
claramente, es el tema
subjects, very
de
important
cuáles son los
subjects
impulsores
of
de pérdida
like
de biodiversidad
what
y
are
cómo
the drivers of loss of
ciertamente los estamos
diversity
abordando.
and
Entonces,
how are we
el
treating
gran
this?
problema
So
es no
the problem
podemos
is that we
seguir
can't
planteando metas de
just
conservación que
establishing
están
conservation
en el
targets
mismo marco de
that are in the
desarrollo que hemos
framework,
tenido en los
the same
últimos
framework of
50, 100
development
años,
that we have
porque
had in
allí
the
pues
last
claramente ya
50
sabemos que
of
eso no va a
100 years,
funcionar.
because we
Más
know that
aún con lo
how
que
is that going to work?
Harvey, Ernesto y todos ustedes han
More,
estado
even more
mencionando,
than
que
what
mientras se
Harvey just
mantenga
said,
la
everybody just said,
dicotomía entre que se
um,
conservan unas partes
we can
y a
say that,
cambio
for
nos damos la
example,
libertad de
we conserve some
transformar
parts and we
completamente
have the
otras,
liberty to
pues
transform the
en
others.
conjunto el
So
resultado
this
de eso
as a whole, the result of this is going to be a catastrophic result for the life on this planet, for all of us, for as one of those species that lives on this planet. In this sense, when we talk about these measures, it comes out also aspects of connectivity, not only spatial, but as we said, on the culture, generation culture, but also a planetary connectivity that is very important. So what Harvey said, to have an interplanetary focus, when we understand this as a whole, until we see the Amazon and all that it represents. So really, we have to have a different focus. And this is a call for all of you that been very generous in sharing your vision that implies to acknowledge new models, or maybe not new models, other ways of governance, other ways and systems of ways of thinking, other ways of understanding the relationship in the planet, economic relationship, because many of those drivers come from other regions and they are having impact in the Amazon. It didn't come from there. So all this gives us a mission that clearly we must invite to the states to have ambitious goals, and these goals have to consider maybe a reflection regarding how we are facing our relationship with nature. And this is a very important learning that we have with original people, because for them, all these questions, it is have nonsense, because if we keep 30% or 40%, the relationship between the productive systems and all that's integrated. So we face new paradigms that has to be placed if we want to have an impact. If we keep the same ideas, we will have the same result that we've already seen in the last 30 years. In 2030 can be a repetition of what we're seeing right now, a call for the ambitious goals and etc. As before concluding, this need to start to integrate the different frameworks, international frameworks, for example, to help the weather crisis, the crisis of conservation and pollution. We have to align all this. We have a learning also from the Convention of the United Nations for the for the weather change, and this is a framework that could also adapt to biodiversity, and that would lead us to a totally different model. Talk about 30% as like the highest ambition, because we could have a different expression regarding on how can it be made in the territories, and how to think on a model that makes closer to the model that can make a conservation of the Amazon, of what we have pure right now on the planet, currently on the planet. So we have to talk about that in as a whole. If you could have 1 minute to talk to the negotiators that are going to be in this event, and to put, what would you tell that person in a minute? What would be the message if you could tell him, and what to expect of that? So we'll have go to each one of you, and then we'll close this event.
With me, okay, that's fantastic. That's a very hard job, but I think I would say that some of you already mentioned before that we have to change our view of how we relate to nature. So I would say that in this next round of targets, we have to consider not only the values that we are considering today that our Western society understands, but also the relational values. So how people relate to themselves, how people relate to their territories. And this is very important so we can define what the target is going to be. Because as you said, it doesn't matter. Well, it matters, but not that much if we are talking about 20, 30, or 70%, if everyone else, all the other areas understand that we have to have a different relation to the territory that we are occupying. So I think that's mainly what I would say. That's a hard job.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you so much. Felipe, en un minuto, ¿qué le dirías
Felipe, in a
a
minute,
esos
what would you tell
negociadores?
to those negotiators? Well, it's very difficult, but have to think very fast. The sense of urgency. It's very dangerous what is happening right now. The solution how to integrate this multi-visions, diversity of visions to the goals the inhabitants have, the inhabitants of the territory that has been conserved, and they want to conserve. It has historically been a rupture between the states and the indigenous organizations of the Amazon. So it is very urgent that the organizations of civil society can have real bridges between the states and the organizations of the inhabitants of the territories. That the state know the visions of the inhabitants of the territories related with this, and the inhabitants of these territories understand also the logic of the states and the international logic. We have 2 months to do that, and we have to activate ourselves right now.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Felipe.
Harvey, ¿qué le dirías en un minuto?
What would you say in a minute to the negotiators?
I would say we need to integrate the conventions and all the international agreements. So we need to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals with the biodiversity goals, with the climate goals, and we need to create this overarching integrated vision of an equitable, nature positive, carbon neutral world. And by 2030, we need to have more nature in the world than we have now. We need to bend the curve of biodiversity loss so that we have a nature positive world by 2030 across all three conditions: cities and farms, shared lands, and large wild areas. And the ocean.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Harvey. Wonderful. Ernesto, un minuto.
Ernesto, you have 1 minute. So the IPCC has said, as well as many other scientists, that we have to take unprecedented measures in human history in order to overcome the ecological global crisis. So for a negotiator, must be overwhelming, right? So I would say to a negotiator that 97% of the time that the human species has walked on the Earth's surface, 97% of that time in our experience have lived in egalitarian societies with low ecological negative impact, and only that 4% the last 10,000 years, when we discovered a way to accumulate in the hands of very few, emerged this terrible idea that it is correct that one human being dominates other, and that has been transferred to our relation with nature. We have religious guidelines that say that we own creation, and particularly when we discovered fossil fuels and we attained a structural capacity that we had never seen before, that led us to a break point. That is the point that we are currently in. That means that the world can change and human beings can generate important changes. This pandemic revealed that another nightmarish world is possible, but it should also reveal that another green and fraternal world is possible. We only have to imagine it and reach for that goal. Thank you very much for those inspiring words, Ernesto. So, well, it has been absolutely wonderful to have this last-minute inspiration words, of course, from the words of my dear colleague, Ana María. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. I'm not sure if I would give that message to the negotiators or to the decision maker, the person that is working on the foreign policy of a given country. Basically, what is decided at a planetary level and what is actually done in each and one of the countries is a responsibility that that decision maker is on his hands. The future of the planet and our survival is beyond political considerations and economic considerations, and we have to radically change if we want to live in a future and a more sustainable planet, always based on science, knowledge, and the practices that gives us the example on how to carry on. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ana María. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for all your generous presentations and interventions, all that you shared today. We hope that this has been a very fruitful session and make a contribution to other sessions that are currently taking place. And this is critical for our near future. Of course, with an ambition that we have to live in harmony with nature. Of course, I would like to thank the Amazon Alliance, the North Amazon Alliance, Gaia, Hildebrand, and all his team for the organization of this session, and also invite you to be aware and expecting the following sessions of this series of webinars. Thank you very much. Have a good day.